Star Trek, Star Wars, the eternal struggle, the eternal competition, right? The eternal science fiction franchise debate. What's better? What do you like better? But here is a fact. Star Trek came first. But I've always wondered, have you, would Star Wars exist without Star Trek? Let's talk about it. So, Star Trek, Star Wars, it's the eternal struggle, right? As both Star Trek and Star Wars fan, I know firsthand that it's a back and forth, a debate really for years. But this is not about Star Trek and Star Wars in terms of quality or what's better, because that's completely what? A subjective thing. That is a personal thing. And I never play the game. I love them both. You know, for whatever reasons, for different reasons, because they're very separate even though they're science fiction. But this is about if Star Wars was to be a juggernaut that it is, if there was no Star Trek, would there be Star Wars? Now, we've all thought about it, I'm sure. Star Trek was first, that's documented, of course, that's historic fact. But what about all the other things that kind of come into play? So, first and foremost, we know that Star Trek was created in 1966. This is an unalterable fact. This is something that no one can argue with. So when you look at it like that, it becomes very, very factual, right? So now in a documentary called Trek Nation, George Lucas admitted that Star Trek influenced Star Wars, that it softened up the entertainment arena, he said, who understood visual sci-fi, like the idea that the fans were kind of primed for Star Wars after seeing Star Trek, okay? And again, there's no arguing there. If you loved Star Trek back in the day and then you started watching Star Wars, you had this sort of secondhand, sort of knowledge or a sort of visual language of starships, warping, phasers, just say ray guns, all the wonderful toys of sci-fi. So now what about a direct sort of, viewing and an active participation for George Lucas? Did he love Star Trek? Well, pretty much. He met with Gene Roddenberry later, I think in the late 80s, 1987, I believe. He said he watched the original Star Trek while writing Star Wars. Now, was it because of just entertainment value? It was because of inspiration. Sure, he could have turned on anything when he was writing the script, but he probably said, let me get, all inspired and get all jazzed and excited about science fiction, about people in space. In a galaxy far, far away, maybe in Star Trek, it was much closer to home, but basically the same environment, the same working environment, like say a sitcom, like say Taxi in a taxi cab, depot, or the office, or what have you. And then what about the idea of him being a fan? So George Lucas has expressed great admiration for Gene Roddenberry's ability to create that science fiction, franchise, and it being character-driven, being about people, about stories about people and relationships, not just about the, warp drive, hyperspace, the faster than light, the ray guns, the robots. And I think that's the key, to both. Because there's many science fiction out there, right? Much saturated, you could argue. But with both Star Trek and Star Wars, it's about the people. Like they say with Star Wars, it's the Lucas saga, right? The Lucas family sort of saga. And then with Star Trek, each crew has their, backstories and their families and friends and such. Usually you say it's driven by Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, the big three. And then later with Next Generation, it would be, say, Picard, Data, Riker, and such. So finally, the idea about the direct copying, or the idea of how much did George Lucas copy? But I don't think so. It was much more of an influence and inspiration. It was much more of science fiction done seriously. Now, George Lucas is on record saying he got most of his inspiration for story from Akira Kurosawa movies. And, this is fact. He said it in many interviews. And so when he looks at those Japanese films and then a lot of 1930s adventure serials, that's the real inspiration. And if you want to say copying or, inspiring Lucas to do that. And with Star Wars, specifically with the droids, I know that came from a movie called The Hidden Fortress, I believe. And that's, basically, I guess they were sort of serfs of Shogun or rather samurai. So you could say the Jedi are sort of samurai, and then I think the two droids of Star Wars, the C-3PO and the R2-D2, are patterned after these two servants or lower tier figures of from the Hidden Fortress. Yet it is still basically their stories. I was always fascinated as a kid that George Lucas says that R2-D2 and C-3PO are basically the main characters of Star Wars. They're all throughout the films, and it's really kind of their stories, like told from their point of view. Whereas with Star Trek, you can argue maybe it's Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, or their point of view. So what do you think? I mean, I just am very glad and grateful that Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek, and then from Roddenberry, Lucas took that inspiration, he ran with it, got more inspired, and he did Star Wars. Nothing copying or clone, inspired. I know when I write, I look at my favorites, like those two incredible franchises. I look at Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune, which I love. A Polish sci-fi writer, Stanislaw Lem, awesome, one of the funniest writers. And all his original works are in Polish, but of course they've been translated to English. And Stanislaw Lem, you've got to check him out, Lem, one of the greats. So what do you think? Give us your thoughts and feedback. Star Trek and Star Wars are the titans of sci-fi, and Lucas is on record saying that Star Wars stood on the shoulders of Star Trek as the foundation, and that's what led him to create it. So one feeds into the other. One obviously, I think, complements the other. And even with ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, Lucas's, effects firm, they started making all the effects for the Star Trek feature films and for the next gen era. A lot of the next gen era, video effects, special effects. So one reaches into the other, right, and complements. Give us your thoughts. Give us your feedback. Hope you're enjoying. Hope you're subscribing. See you soon.
Logic is the beginning of wisdom, but not with the sci-fi guy.